交叉的学科，各个不同的学科啊，大家一起来讨论。我们是北京大学的高等人文研究院，而不是人文学的研究院。意思说，反之是在社会科学或者自然科学对人文有关怀，也就是关切政治，也不要从政，这个参与社会，注重文化，这对我们讲起来都是我们的对话的伙伴。那么这次我觉得非常荣幸，也很高兴，也是非常难得的机会。就前几天，我们才安排了请两位我非常熟的朋友，一位呢是陈静女士，她应该在的，那她是叫做《哈佛经济笔记》的作者，已经出了一本，那么第二本呢马上要出版。那么陈静女士呢？他的夫婿，就是他的先生，也是我的一个好朋友，就是 Cooper 教授。这个 Cooper 教授是哈佛的讲座教授，世界上可能呢最重要的一位经济，特别是关于国际经济。那么他曾经担任有一个美国在经济方面最有影响的一个组织，也是直接影响华盛顿，叫 Peterson Institute。他这个 Institute， 他是从开始成立了，就是他的学术委员会的主席，大概有20年以前，20年之上。那么现在他的继承人呢，就以前的哈佛的大学的校长Larry Summers。那么他曾经在美国政府，也就是美国的总统6届总统，他是属于经济委员会的顾问之一。在卡特总统的时候，他有一天也曾经代理过美国的国务卿。虽然如此呢，他在经济方面的影响非常大。他是桃李满天下。有一度美国的就是美联储，在这美联储的所有的关于国际经济的这个代表都是他的学生。他在耶鲁大学教过很多年的书，那么耶鲁大学的校长Levin 就上过他的课，他可以说是桃李满天下我们是非常熟的朋友，所以觉得非常高兴能够请他来做报告我们就讲好了，他这个报告基本上是英文的，但是在发问的时候呢，也可以用英文，也可以用中文。I'm really very greatly honored to have this chance to introduce Professor Richard Cooper, who is a chair professor at Harvard University, and also no doubt one of the leading economists with emphasis on international economics. And he's very much interested in exploring the world economic situation after the financial crisis. And he's going to address himself to 4 major areas: the United States, Europe, Japan, and China. So it's my great pleasure to ask Professor Cooper to give his presentation, probably for about an hour. Then we'll open up for discussion. Dick.
You want me to sit here? Or?
No, you just sit over here.
Just here.
Yeah, don't worry. Sit over here would be fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is my first visit to the Institute of Humanistic Studies at Peking University, and set up by my old friend and sometime colleague, Professor Du Ming, and I'm extremely pleased to be here. It is not my first visit to China. I'm not sure I have an exact count, but I think it's my 20th visit to China. My first visit to China was 32 years ago, in 1979, and as I look at the faces in this room, I suspect that was before many of you, most of you, were born. I remember the old China. The old China, of course, is not ancient China, but the China of 30 years ago, and I have watched, observed the incredible changes that have taken place in this country over the last 30 years. Just extraordinary what has happened. and on the whole, for the better. I would even say for the much better. A word of warning to students: do not take your existing life for granted. Study some history, talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, ask them even embarrassing questions. They had, in general, they had a much rougher life than you're having, and you need to understand where they.
希望有一种交叉的学科，各个不同的学科啊，大家一起来讨论。我们是北京大学的高等人文研究院，而不是人文学的研究院。意思说，反之是在社会科学或者自然科学对人文有关怀，也就是关切政治，你不要从政，这个参与社会，注重文化，这对我们讲起来都是我们的对话的伙伴。那么这次我觉得非常荣幸，也很高兴，也是非常难得的机会。就前几天，我们才安排了请2位我非常熟的朋友，一位呢是陈静女士，她应该在的，那她是叫做《哈佛经济笔记》的作者，已经出了1本。那么第2本呢，马上要出版。那么陈静女士呢，她的夫婿就是她的先生，也是我的一个好朋友，就是库珀教授。这个库珀教授是哈佛的讲座教授，世界上可能呢最重要的一位经济，特别是关于国际经济。那么他曾经担任有一个美国在经济方面最有影响的一个组织，也是直接影响华盛顿，叫 Peterson Institute。他这个 Institute 他是从开始成立了，就是他的学术委员会的主席，大概有20年以前，20年之上。那么现在他的继承人呢，就以前的哈佛的大学的校长Larry Summers。那么他曾经在美国政府，也就是美国的总统6届总统，他是属于经济委员会的顾问之一。在卡特总统的时候，他有一天也曾经代理过美国的国务卿。虽然如此呢，他在经济方面的影响非常大。他是桃李满天下。有一度美国的就是美联储，在这美联储的所有的关于国际经济的这个代表都是他的学生。他在耶鲁大学教过很多年的书，那么耶鲁大学的校长叫 Levin 就上过他的课，他可以说是桃李满天下我们是非常熟的朋友，所以觉得非常高兴能够请他来做报告我们就讲好了，他这个报告基本上是英文的，但是在发问的时候呢，也可以用英文，也可以用中文。I'm really very greatly honored to have this chance to introduce Professor Richard Cooper, who is a chair professor at Harvard University, and also no doubt one of the leading economists with emphasis on international economics. And he's very much interested in exploring the world economic situation after the financial crisis. And he's going to address himself to 4 major areas: the United States, Europe, Japan, and China. So it's my great pleasure to ask Professor Cooper to give his presentation probably for about an hour. Then we'll open up for discussion. Dick.
You want me to sit here? Or?
No, you just sit over here.
Just here.
Don't worry. Sit over here would be fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is my first visit to the Institute of Humanistic Studies at Peking University, and set up by my old friend and sometime colleague, Professor Due Ming, and I'm extremely pleased to be here. It is not my first visit to China. I'm not sure I have an exact count, but I think it's my 20th visit to China. My first visit to China was 32 years ago, in 1979, and as I look at the faces in this room, I suspect that was before many of you, most of you, were born. I remember the old China. The old China, of course, is not ancient China, but the China of 30 years ago, and I have watched, observed the incredible changes that have taken place in this country over the last 30 years. Just extraordinary what has happened. And on the whole, for the better, I would even say for the much better. A word of warning to students: do not take your existing life for granted. Study some history, talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, ask them even embarrassing questions. They had, in general, they had a much rougher life than you're having. And you need to understand where they came from to appreciate what you have achieved or your country has achieved to reach where we are in 2011. The world at the moment is in a rather bad patch. We had 3 years ago a really serious financial crisis. Again, trying to think of history in my own mind, I have to go back to 1931, which was before I was born. But to go back to 1931 to find a period in which the financial structure of the world economy was as bad as it was in the fall of 2008. Tremendous amount of risk aversion set in, and the financial market, or some parts of the financial market, virtually seized up. It's a common human tendency when something goes wrong to want to discover who is responsible, who is to blame for this mess that we got into. And as I've thought about that question, I've concluded myself that, depending on how one puts it, either no one is to blame or everyone is to blame. It really was, I think, a system failure. We can play the thought experiment that nobody did anything wrong. That is counterfactual. We know that there was malfeasance. We know that people did things that were wrong. But I like to play the thought experiment. Suppose everyone was doing his job, viewed narrowly, but everyone was doing his job properly as he conceived it, and I think we still would have had a crisis, a financial crisis. And that is actually bad news. That suggests that the system is more fragile than we thought it was. And we need to, the problem was no one was thinking about the system as a whole. Many people were doing their jobs properly. Some people were doing their jobs improperly, and some people were not doing their jobs at all. But no one was thinking about the system as a whole. So when it began to unravel, starting with the housing sector in the United States and the financial support for the housing sector in the United States, it unraveled to an extent that no one could have imagined before that. And I have to say, I think that my own profession, the economics profession, is complicit in this system failure. Economists who have become, and no doubt some of you here are studying economics, economics have become increasingly more and more mathematical in the formulation of problems and the discovery of solutions to problems. I'm not against that. On the contrary, I think mathematics is an extremely powerful tool for sorting out, particularly when things can go one way or can go another, for sorting out what the relevant variables are. But I think we all need to be reminded that any mathematical model presumes a stable structure, and the structure itself may be at risk. So all of you who do mathematical modeling, and particularly if you go into financial institutions and do mathematical modeling for the financial institutions, be conscious of the fact that however sophisticated the models may be, they do assume a structure, and that structure may not last forever. In the first place, the mathematical structure is only an approximation to a much more complex reality. And secondly, in a dynamic society and economy, whatever the structure is and however sophisticated, it won't last forever. And so you have to be alert to changes in the structure and potential weaknesses in the structure. And the problem was, collectively, we were not. We became complacent. One of my colleagues, Greg Mankiw, called this period that we had from roughly 1990 to 1996 the Great Moderation. The Great Moderation, low inflation, good growth, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And very few people recognized that we were on a precipice and about to go over. Well, that's by way of background. We can talk more in the question period, if you like, about the crisis. What I propose to do today is be more forward-looking and talk about the current situation and the near future outlook for the world economy. The financial crisis started in the United States and very quickly affected Europe directly. So the countries involved in the financial crisis were the United States, Britain, Spain, Ireland, tiny Iceland, Germany, a number of countries. Not Canada, interestingly enough, not China, not Japan, except at the fringes. But the financial crisis produced a recession. The deepest recession since the 1930s. I don't like to compare it with the 1930s because that was so much worse than this one was. Just to give you one quantitative indicator, unemployment reached 10%, a little above 10% in the United States in 2009. It reached 25% in 1933, as it did in Germany, and that was really the precursor of what we Americans called World War II, but I'm talking about the European part of World War II. I know in this part of the world there was the Pacific War, or the Sino-Japanese War, as you sometimes call it here, which also had its roots in the Great Depression. You have to look at the internal interstices of Japanese politics to appreciate the influence of the Great Depression on Japanese politics. So this was much, much less severe, but nonetheless it was very severe, and worldwide. So the financial crisis was limited to perhaps half a dozen countries, but the consequential recession affected all countries around the world. Recovery started just about 2 years ago in the third quarter of 2009, and it has been proceeding since quite smartly in China and in India, but very slowly in the United States, in Europe, and in Japan, the three big, rich societies in the world. Much more slowly than a normal recovery would be. I'm going to focus first on the United States. I identify three reasons why this recovery has been so weak. The first is housing, the starting point for the financial crisis. We built far too many houses. In the peak year of construction, 2005, we built over 2 million houses. Now, I recognize that in China, 2 million is not a big number. You are building 14 million houses as we speak. But we built too many houses, and it was too many for the United States. That was way above new household formation and the usual allowance for attrition, wearing out of houses. And just to give you the magnitude of the change, over 2 million houses in 2005, now we're building 600,000 houses. So essentially a 70% fall in the production of houses. And we still have an overhang of housing, and that is acting as a drag on the economy, because the construction, and there's no incentive to get the construction starting again. Now, I need to say here that the United States, like China, is a very big country, and there are big differences in different parts of the country. And the housing overhang is not universal. It is by now located in a few parts of the country, not everywhere in the country, but nonetheless, the overhang of housing is still impeding the recovery from the recession. We will work that off. It'll take a few more years, but we are gradually working that off. The second inhibitor to the recovery is the financial system itself, and particularly the banks. The banks found, the financial institutions in general, and especially the banks, found that they'd taken many more risks than they were aware of before the financial crisis. And in particular, they were engaged in over-leveraging. As we say, they had too much debt. They were borrowing in order to buy assets and make money on the difference. And they had maturity mismatches. They were borrowing at the short end and lending at the long end, mortgage lending for housing, for example. And so the banks are in the position now of repairing their balance sheets. And they are under, first, they do that because it makes sense. Each of them understands that. But they are also under very strong pressure from the regulators to improve their balance sheets. And so the banks are not lending nearly as much as they normally would be doing at this stage of the recession. So that's a second factor impeding the recession. That too will pass, but it'll take time as the banks, and it's been happening, but the banks are gradually improving their balance sheets. The third factor that is impeding the recession is oil prices. Oil prices, to remind you, went way, way up in 2008. Then, with the onset of the crisis, they came way down. Up means over $140 a barrel. They came way down below $30 a barrel in 2009. And then, with recovery, as one would expect, oil prices began to rise again. But this year, in early this year, they rose much more than people expected and much more than could be accounted for by the state of the recovery. A variety of reasons. The most obvious one is the loss of Libyan oil. Libya was a middle-sized producer, produced maybe 1.6, 1.7 million barrels a day of oil. But Libyan oil happens to be exceptionally sweet oil. It's very good, very high quality oil. And most of the European refineries are keyed to using this good quality oil. It happens, thanks to the recession, that we have excess capacity in the world, and Saudi Arabia has increased its production, but it's the wrong kind of oil. It's sour oil or high sulfur oil, and the European refineries are not keyed. I know this is going to sound funny to some of you, but crude oil is not a single product. It is, in fact, a highly differentiated product. There are many, many different grades of crude oil, and we lost a very good grade of crude oil in Libya, and we're making up with a rather poor grade of crude oil from Saudi Arabia, and that requires big adjustments, both in the shipment of oil around the world and in the relative prices of oil. And then with some financial speculation on top of the loss of Libyan oil, we've seen oil prices now up above $100 a barrel. Why does that matter? Well, here institutional factors come into play. In the United States, crude oil prices get passed quite quickly into the prices that ordinary people pay, which during the wintertime means heating oil, and in the summertime or all year means gasoline. And crude oil prices get passed quite quickly into oil prices in the United States. That is not true in Europe, because the taxes in Europe are so high that small changes, even big changes in the oil price, have only small changes in the final selling price. And it's not true in China, because your government controls the prices of oil at the pump. And so you don't feel the impact of big changes, or you feel it only with a lag. But as economists say, the demand for oil in the short run is very inelastic, insensitive to price. So as American consumers pay more for their oil products, they have less money to spend on other things. And so that's a third factor which is impeding the pace of recovery. The best guess, I am not a forecaster, but I pay attention to what the forecasters say, and the best guess is that the U.S. economy will grow only about 2.5% this year. That is actually, for the U.S., a respectable rate of growth for the long term, but coming out of a recession that we've had, we should be growing at 4% rather than 2.5%. Next year looks a little bit better, but not a lot better. Gradually, these factors that I've mentioned will diminish in their impact unless oil prices go up further. And so next year, the outlook is for growth of perhaps someplace between 3 and 3.5%. The implication of this very moderate recovery is that unemployment, which, as I mentioned, reached 10%, it's now down to around 9%. It will fall, but it will fall very, very gradually. So it probably won't be until 2015, 4 years from now, that we get back to what we consider full employment, which is an unemployment rate someplace between 5 and 6%. That's the normal churning of the American economy, produces unemployment between 5 and 6% during the time. So recovery is underway, but it's a weak recovery, and it means unemployment will come down slowly. That possibly has some political implications for the next election. It has some implications for protectionist pressures in the American political system. So China actually has a direct interest in U.S. unemployment rates because the higher they are, the more the protectionist pressure will build against goods from everywhere, but including China in everywhere. What I've said so far has been crowded off the page, off the TV shows and the newspaper pages entirely by a heated debate going on in Washington now over raising the debt ceiling. We can spend, again, as much time as you want on this subject in the question period as you like. I just want to assert my view here that there is no serious economic content in this debate over the debt ceiling. This debate is a debate that should not be taking place at all. The debt ceiling shouldn't exist, but given that it exists, it should have been raised routinely, as we've done about 50 times in the last since the Second World War. But the House Republicans chose to make an issue of it this time, and I think the only way to describe it is political theater. It is political theater in Washington. Of course, political theater is loved by the journalists, and so the journalists feature it heavily. I've noticed even in China, on the TV news, you have something on the discussion of the U.S. debt debate. I think the only thing I want to say here about it is that a best guess is that it will be resolved probably on July 31st or August 2nd, or August 1st. The drop dead date allegedly being August 2nd. It'll be resolved at the last minute. That's a best guess. I will not be troubled if it is not resolved. And if the debt ceiling is not raised, that throws the initiative to President Obama, and he has several courses of action to take, each one of which will, strictly speaking, be illegal. But that's the position Congress will have put him in. One, and I think in a way to an economist the most obvious one, is just to ignore the debt ceiling and continue to float U.S. government bonds in the market. I have no doubt that the market will continue to take them. And so the debt ceiling will turn out be shown to be totally superfluous. That would be my advice to him. That's sort of the easy way out. But if he wants to play political hardball, which is what the House Republicans are playing these days, he could take the alternative course, which is to cut government expenditures. And again, strictly speaking, illegal, because Congress appropriates the money. The President, as the Chief Executive of the United States, is actually obliged to spend the money. But with this situation, I'm hypothesizing, he either has to do something illegal one way or another. So he could cut expenditures. I would actually start with veterans benefits, and I would put the blame entirely where it belongs, which is on the House Republicans. But I'm not a politician, and Obama has made the mistake, in my view, but he is a politician, of negotiating this issue instead of putting the responsibility where it lies. What I am absolutely certain of is that he will not cut interest on the outstanding public debt. That would have such far-reaching consequences worldwide, not just in the United States, that it will not be on the list of expenditures to cut. So I find myself somewhat bemused by the discussion on the TV of the possible default of the United States on its debt. In my view, it is not on under any circumstances. And there's no reason why not raising the debt ceiling would lead to default on the U.S. public debt. That's not so important for you, because I assume most of the people in this room do not own Treasury bills, but PBOC owns lots and lots and lots of U.S. government securities. So it's of great interest to China, even if not to all Chinese. Let me say a little bit about Europe. Europe was caught up in the financial crisis, mainly Britain, Spain, Ireland. All three countries had big housing booms, like the United States. Germany, which did not have a big housing boom, but where financial institutions were engaged with their Anglo-Saxon counterparts. They held a lot of American securities, and they were borrowing heavily in the short-term money market. Tiny Iceland had its own crisis. And this was all part of the bigger financial crisis. What was not anticipated, recovery, remember, started about 2 years ago in middle of 2009. What was not anticipated is the second crisis, which hit Europe and has so far been limited to Europe, starting with Greece in basically the last month of 2010 was when the last month of 2009 and January of 2010 when the Greek crisis. The crisis of the first financial crisis involved largely privately issued securities. The Greek crisis involved securities issued by a government in the new European currency, the euro. And I assume you're all familiar with the European situation, but let me just remind you, most European countries today, leaving aside Russia and Ukraine, among the big ones, and Turkey, most European countries are now a member of the European Union. 27 countries, with Croatia probably to become 28 next year, number 28 next year. There's still a few countries that are outside. Switzerland is the most important country outside the European Union, leaving aside Russia and Ukraine. Of those 27 countries, 17 now have adopted a common currency called the euro. The latest one, just joining this year, was tiny Estonia, became the 17th member of the Eurozone. Greece is a member of the Eurozone. The big countries, Britain and Sweden, are not members of the Eurozone, but most of the other large European countries are members of the Eurozone. And the crisis started with Greece, which does not have its own currency. It uses this common currency. And then the crisis, I don't like to say the crisis spread, because I actually think the differences among these countries are very important, very significant. But Ireland was also hit by a crisis, also not having its own currency, and Portugal. These three countries together make up about 4% of the GDP of the Eurozone, which in turn is only a part of the European Union. So in economic terms, these three countries are not terribly consequential, but of course what happens in them is very consequential for the people who live in them. And Greece in particular is in serious, serious trouble. The trouble, as the Germans never ceased to point out, was due to their own fiscal indiscipline. The Greeks had 10 years, more if you really want to count it, but anyway, at least 10 years of serious fiscal indiscipline, which was facilitated, paradoxically, by their membership in the Eurozone, because it meant they could borrow in a European-wide market, or even in an international market, in euro-denominated bonds. And the interest rate that they paid on those bonds up until late 2007 was only 30 basis points above the interest rate that Germany paid, 30 basis points. So we see that just as in the US mortgage-backed securities market, there was a tremendous underpricing of risk, we now understand. It turns out there was also a tremendous underpricing of risk in the European sovereign debt market. The Greeks could borrow for barely more than Germany was paying. And that encouraged fiscal lack of discipline. And that's what happened. So if one is in the position of being moralistic about it, I think the Germans are absolutely right. The Greeks got themselves into this trouble, and they did it through indiscipline. But I tend to approach problems not from a moralistic point of view, but from a problem-solving point of view. The Greeks are in serious difficulty. What are the implications of that difficulty for the rest of Europe? And how do we get out of it? What are the ways to get out of it? And the Europeans have been wrestling with that issue since January of 2010, so now for a year and a half. I guess one has to say it has not been a pretty sight. The Europeans, in my view, have systematically mishandled this issue. The first thing they did, it happens for reasons not related to the crisis. I was actually in Greece in January of 2010, and I said there's a straightforward, not easy, but a straightforward path to follow, which is you go to the International Monetary Fund, you pose your problem to the International Monetary Fund, it tells you, it gives you some advice on what you should do, and it lends you a lot of money while you're taking their advice. We have lots and lots of experience now with countries that have run into financial difficulties. The distinctive feature of the Greek situation was that it does not have its own currency. That's a new element and a complicating element. The Europeans made the mistake, in my view, of saying, no, this is a European problem, the Europeans can solve it. We can solve it on our own. They said that in January. And then they dithered for 3.5 months, and they unnecessarily, in my view, converted a Greek problem into a European problem. And then they decided finally that Greece should go to the International Monetary Fund. Something they should have done in January, but they didn't get around to that until May. They didn't get around. So they lost 3 months, and they unnecessarily converted it into a European problem. And they've been trying to address it ever since. We just had a very important meeting of the leaders of the European Union just this past weekend, in which they agreed on the latest round, which I actually think is a very positive development, finally. They agreed on the latest round for helping out Greece. It does not solve the problem. It kicks the can down the road, as we say in the child game of kicking the can. It procrastinates, but sometimes procrastination is actually a very sensible policy. So it deals with the issue notionally for the next 3 years, probably in practice only for the next 2 years, because the markets anticipate the end of any program. Above all, it reduces the interest rates, which the Europeans have been asking of the Greeks, from 5.5% to 3.5%. That's real help. That's a significant help. But whatever way one looks at it, Greece is in for a very rough time for a number of years, probably 4 or 5 years. The focus of public discussion has been on the debt problem, the sovereign debt problem, and that's what the European effort has been addressing. But one can play, I like to play thought experiments. So another thought experiment is, suppose the Greek debt was wiped off the board altogether. We just don't think about the Greek debt, just take it away. Is Greece home clear? And the answer is no. Greece has a very serious problem of competitiveness. One of the things that happened during this decade of profligacy is that Greece became very uncompetitive in the European and worldwide context. And so the debt issue is only half of the problem for Greece. The Greek government has undertaken some extremely stringent measures, 2 rounds of them, one last year after the IMF program, and one just a few months ago in May. 2 years ago, any observer would have said such measures are politically impossible. One cannot imagine a country undertaking them. But now we've seen Greece has actually undertaken 2 rounds of serious measures. They've cut government salaries of all government employees by 15%. That's an extremely rare event. Hong Kong has done that after the Asian financial crisis, but Hong Kong is very special. It's a very rare event, and private sector wages have come down. They've cut pensions. They've raised the pension age from what admittedly was extremely generous, 55. It's nice to be able to think of the possibility of retiring at 55. We're all living much and much longer. Of course, that's devastating for the budget. If we all live to be 75 and retire at 55, we're all living on the public pension for 20 years. So that's a problem every country has, by the way. Greece just had a particularly acute version of it. So they've raised the pension age, and anyway, they've made lots and lots of changes. Whether they will be enough, we'll just have to wait and see. There's a serious problem of tax collection in Greece. It's one thing for a government to pass taxes. It's another thing actually to collect the revenues. And Greece does not have a good record at collecting tax revenues. So that's Greece. I won't talk about Portugal and Ireland. The detailed stories are different in very important ways, I think. Greece is the most serious by far. But the overall bottom line is that the European economic recovery, like that in the United States, is actually quite weak. It's even weaker than in the United States. To put a number on it, the best guess for this year, 1.9% growth, compared with 2.5% in the United States. And Europe, like the US and like China, is a very big and very diverse area, so there are big differences. Sweden is doing very well. Spain is doing exceptionally badly, and with Germany and Britain being someplace in between. But the overall picture is one of relatively weak recovery, and as in the US, high lingering unemployment, only slow decline in unemployment. Japan is in an analogous situation, complicated in Japan's case by the terrible earthquake and tsunami of last March. So Japan will probably register negative growth this year due to the disruptions created by those natural events. But paradoxically, Japan will probably show a relatively good growth rate next year as it organizes itself to repair the damage that the earthquake and the tsunami did. It's one of the paradoxes of economics that destroying capital often leads to a higher growth rate. Why? Because we measure growth rates in terms of current output, and as you move to repair the capital that's been damaged, that actually increases output. So these three rich areas stand in stark contrast to the three big emerging markets, as they're now called, China, India, and Brazil. But one could also add Indonesia and a number of other countries, which also were hit not by the financial crisis, but by the recession, but are recovering rather nicely. Turkey, I should have mentioned also, are recovering rather nicely from the recession. I want to give credit where credit is due. China was the first of the really big countries to announce a stimulus package. China announced a stimulus package in November of 2008. The G20 meeting, in which the G20 countries all agreed that we should all have stimulus packages, came after the Chinese had made their announcement. And I happened to be in China in December of 2008, and I tried very hard to find out what was in the stimulus package. The government said we're going to, what was it, 4 trillion yuan, and they even announced how they were going to pay for it. 30% on the budget, 70% through the banks. I tried very hard to find out what the content was, and I failed. Sometimes it's hard to get information in China because it's a secret. But in this case, I persuaded myself, after talking to a number of friends in the Chinese government, that the reason I could not find out what was in the stimulus package was the Chinese did not know yet what was in the stimulus package. They announced it first, and then the ministry scrambled around to figure out what the content was going to be. But nonetheless, it was a very substantial stimulus package, financed mainly through the banking system, and it blunted the recession in China very nicely, and the recovery has taken place. I know there's some disappointment with a growth rate of only 9.5%, but I want to tell you that only in China is 9.5% a weak growth rate. Everywhere else, that would be considered fantastic. So I think China managed the situation well. I do think, and I hope there are no illusions about this, China played its own game of procrastination in the stimulus package. It financed much of this through the banking system. The banks in turn lent to local authorities or special vehicles, special organizations created by local authorities, and I have very little doubt that many of these loans will not be paid back. Sometimes because the loans were actually badly used, Sometimes because the loans, even though they were well used, they did not produce revenue-generating activities. For example, we all around the world have been marveling at the high-speed train network and how fast China put it up. But my understanding is that the fares that are being charged, although higher than on ordinary railroads, do not cover even the operating costs of the high-speed rail, do not cover even the operating cost, no contribution to the capital costs. So these loans will not be paid back unless there's some radical change that I don't foresee. That is not a disaster in my view. That is spreading the fiscal implications of the Chinese stimulus package over several years. Instead of all at once, the government, as we did in the United States, the government put out the money in 2 years. China did it, much of it through the banking system. The government will be paying still 5 years from now, as it essentially recapitalizes the banks and takes these bad loans off the books of the local authorities. And that's okay as long as everyone understands what's going on. The banks really served as fiscal agents of the Chinese government during this period, and that, reasonably straightforward once you actually understand what's going on. Now, I read that inflation is a problem in China. I didn't say anything about inflation for the US or Europe. I should have done. Let me just say now, inflation is not a problem in the US, and it's not a problem in Europe. Of course, we experienced the rise in oil prices and the rise in corn prices. Some commodity prices have gone up. Much of that is related to the recovery itself. So we don't look at these highly volatile prices in order to assess inflationary pressures. We look at underlying what we call core inflation, which takes out the volatile prices, or we look at wage rates, or we look at the expectations as reflected in bond prices in bond markets. And on all three counts, core inflation, wage rates, and expectations reflected in bond markets, inflation in the United States is very, very low for the foreseeable future. Foreseeable future is not the same as forever, but for the immediate future, the inflation outlook is inflation is well under control in the United States. I would make the same judgment in Europe, although Britain is something of an exception. Britain did not join the euro area, and one of the consequences of the financial crisis was the British pound depreciated against the dollar and the euro by about 30%. And so Britain has had a rise measured in pounds, a rise in prices of imported goods, which affects the consumer price index. Wage rates are still under good control in Britain. So the situation's a little more complicated than in the United States. Anyway, China is worried about inflation. Brazil, India, Turkey, these several countries that where the recovery is going very nicely are all show somewhat concern about inflation. India, the Reserve Bank of India just raised interest rates by 50 basis points yesterday to reflect its concern with inflation. Now, your Prime Minister has said that inflation is now his _1 economic priority to worry about. My view, and there's some suggestion in Chinese think tanks and among mid-level officials that the origin of Chinese inflation is U.S. monetary policy. We can discuss that more in the question period if you want in more technical detail. But my basic view, again, I'm a problem solver, my basic view is that China's inflation is entirely in China's hands. Entirely in China's hands. And just at the moment, I would not have made this statement 2 years ago or 4 years ago, but just at the moment, there is an obvious and straightforward way for China to deal with its inflation, and that is to appreciate the currency. Appreciating the currency would affect inflation through 3 different channels, all mutually reinforcing. And so let me talk about those 3 channels for a moment, and then give my bottom line, which is even harsher. The first channel is, of course, the price of all imported goods measured in RMB would drop. If the currency goes up by 10%, just to choose an illustrative number, the local price of oil products drops by 10%. So all imported goods, the prices drop at once. Secondly, appreciating the currency would reduce demand in the export industry. And one of the things that China has to do, one way or another, if it takes inflation seriously, is reduce aggregate demand. Well, raising the currency reduces aggregate demand, happens to hit the export sector, but it reduces aggregate demand, which is necessary to fight inflation. The third channel is the monetary channel. Given China's exchange rate policy, given China's huge trade surplus, and net capital inflow, net private capital inflow, China's exchange rate policy is by itself strongly inflationary. The People's Bank of China is striving valiantly to sterilize the monetary impact of the balance of payment surplus. So it's raised reserve requirements many times on the banks now. It floats central bank bonds to soak up the extra liquidity. And it's done a number of things to help sterilize the impact of the surplus. But this is a losing battle. The People's Bank of China is doing what it can, but it cannot do 100%. The surplus is so big that monetary expansion is built in. And so to repeat, China has an obvious instrument entirely in China's hands to deal with China's inflation now, and that's appreciating the currency, direct impact on prices, reducing aggregate demand, and reducing the monetary expansion that is implicit in the is a consequence of the balance of payment surplus. So all 3 channels, and of course they would reinforce one another. Now I'm going to make the really hard statement. I do not think China can succeed in reducing its inflation without appreciating the RMB. China at the present time has policies, macroeconomic policies, which are contradictory. One is a stated anti-inflation policy, and the other is don't rock the boat on the exchange rate policy. And those 2 policies are in direct conflict with one another. So I think China will experience, one way or another, what economists call real appreciation of the currency. Real appreciation can come about in either of 2 ways. One is to raise the nominal exchange rate, and the other is to have inflation relative to the rest of the world, so that Chinese prices go up domestically, and that appreciates the currency through that particular route. It's the Chinese Prime Minister who said inflation is his #1 problem. I didn't say that. And if I were the Prime Minister of China, I don't think I would make inflation my #1 priority. So that's a debate that you Chinese need to have. Is this the correct statement of priorities in economic policy? But my claim is that if it is, then you must appreciate your currency. Not only is that the obvious thing to do, you actually have to do it. The alternative is to accept higher inflation. Now, when I said this to another group, they said, well, but appreciating the currency will hurt someone. And in particular, it will hurt the export industry. That is absolutely correct. But I want to generalize the statement. There is no way to fight inflation without hurting someone. It does not have to be the export industry. It could be the construction industry. You could beat the hell out of construction. Just tell the banks not to lend anything more for any more construction loans, stop building housing. That's going to hurt somebody. That's going to hurt the whole construction industry and all the migrant workers who are working in it. An alternative is to let inflation run. Presumably the government has decided not to do that because that will hurt somebody. People, the Chinese public, is going to complain about inflation. Some people, paradoxically, will actually benefit from inflation, but many people, if they find their wages not rising as rapidly as prices are rising, they find their real incomes going down. So the fact is, China is in a situation where somebody has to be hurt. And it is the job of politicians, that's their social function, is to make choices in a difficult situation. So that's the situation the Chinese authorities. President Obama is also in a very difficult situation, but the structure of the situation is different in the United States than it is in China. China wants to fight inflation, and it's going to have to hurt somebody to do it. It can spread the hurt around. There are various ways of doing that, but the notion that you can fight inflation successfully without hurting somebody means you haven't understood what the nature of the problem is. So I've talked for more than an hour already, so why don't I stop there. Let me just pull things together. The outlook for the world economy is continued growth. The IMF projects about 3%. That's certainly better than recession. It's not great, but it's better than recession. But the growth is being pulled mainly by emerging markets, by China, by Indonesia, by Brazil, by Turkey, by India, and the rich countries, the rich economies, are also recovering, but they're recovering more slowly than the emerging markets are. Well, I've said a lot of hair's loose. Why don't I stop and invite comments, questions, observations of things that I should have said but didn't, anything that comes to your mind.
Well, thank you very much for your very succinct and in a way comprehensive view of some of the major economies in the world: US, Europe, Japan, briefly, and China. So let's open for general discussion. Let me pose something which is very naive. We normally talk about not just...
when somebody starts out by saying he has a naive question, get on your guard.
This is a genuinely naive question. Well, genuinely naive question. Normally, if we talk about the BRICS, even with an S, we're talking about Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa. But you made at least 2 references to Indonesia. And I think I have a very strong sense that Indonesia is going to be a very strong economy, partly because of the leadership. I think the Indonesian leadership in the last 10 years has been terrific. And would you make just a brief comment why Indonesia is now listed as a major, as potential economy? I made one reference when I was at UC Berkeley, and there's the notion about the Berkeley Mafia. And those Berkeley economists to help Suharto to develop Indonesian economy, but I think obviously that was not necessarily a totally successful story. But you made a reference, so I'm curious.
Well, I have to start with a declaration of interest. I was actually an advisor to the Indonesian government in the early 1970s, precisely with Wijoyo and what was called the Berkeley Mafia. It was an extraordinary experience. I'd worked in the U.S. government and I'd had some experience in some other countries. But at that moment in time, this is now 40 years ago, the Indonesian government had the most highly trained, the most economically literate cabinet in the world. There were no fewer than 7 PhDs in economics in the Indonesian cabinet. And it's a really interesting story how they got there. They had been, most of them were trained in the US with scholarships from the Ford Foundation. And they went back to Indonesia and became dissidents under the Sukarno government. They staffed the economics department of the University of Indonesia. And then Indonesia had an absolutely terrible civil war in 1965, and the generals took over. The generals knew that one of the big problems was the economy, and so they had these professors of economics come up to the Army Staff College in Bandung to give them lectures on economics. And I do not know what the dynamic was in the Army Staff College in Bandung. It was either that, well, it was some combination of economics is too hard a subject for us generals to master, but these professors of economics don't seem so bad. They seem like reasonable guys, so maybe we'll just put them in charge. And so a man called Wijoyo, and then he was the deputy prime minister, and then he had a series of ministers, which were professors of economics. And Indonesia started out with a very poor country. And this is 40 years ago, a very poor country. Indonesia started out with a very good economic policy for that country, for a country at that level of development. Very different from the economic policy in India, in China, in Egypt, in most of the other developing countries at that moment. Very different. I was one of their advisors.
Dwight Perkins was one of them?
Dwight Perkins was one of their advisors, yes, indeed. So actually, Indonesia did very well economically during the subsequent, let's say, 25 years. There's an object lesson in Indonesia, which I think countries around the world need to pay attention to. If Suharto, General Suharto, but he retired from the army and became the president, if he had retired after 15 years in office, he would go down as the father of his country, modern country. He would go down in history as having done a fabulous performance. But he hung on, and he hung on, and he hung on. And I don't know what there is about political leaders, unless they're thrown out, as we do in the United States from time to time. They come to think of themselves as being totally indispensable. They cannot imagine their country moving forward without them. And that happened to Suharto, it happened to Mubarak in Egypt, same story. Mubarak actually was quite a reasonable president for the first decade that he was president of Egypt, but he hung on too long, and we see that time and time again. Political leaders need to learn when to retire. Mao Zedong did not know when to retire. And I think one of the most sensible things the Communist Party has done is to say we're going to limit ourselves now to no appointments after the age of 70. I actually don't like that, because I'm over 70 now and I think I'm in good shape. But what it means is that no Chinese leader can expect to last beyond, well, he can finish his term, but then the leadership must change. Very wise move. African countries would have benefited enormously by adopting such a rule 20 years ago. And the problem in Indonesia. So Indonesia had actually, for its level of income, a very unusually strong economy. It ran into the Asian financial crisis. It actually looked like it was going to get through the Asian financial crisis quite well, even as late as October of, we're now talking about 1997. The crisis had hit Thailand, it hit Malaysia, it hit the Philippines, it had hit Indonesia, but it looked like Indonesia would get through. But then the politics began to unravel. And so Indonesia went through a period of, depending on how you count, let's say 5 years, essentially of reconstructing its political system. And now it seems to be back on track, and it can turn back to economic policy. But I think the Indonesian story is a very interesting one, and on the whole, a positive one.
Well, let me ask, I cannot resist the temptation, ask a question, it's radically different. I think you made it very clear that your approach is problem solving. You want to relegate the whole moral, ethical questions to the background. But as we know, the financial crisis, as understood by the American public, was not simply a question of institution. It's a question people considered that some of the financial institutions, not just the CEOs, but some of the experts in the financial enterprise, I don't know, Goldman Sachs is implicated in this, became too greedy. And that turned out to be disastrous for the American system. Now we need the experts to help us out, and many of the experts turned out to be the beneficiaries of that crisis. I don't know. This is, of course, a cynical way of looking at the situation. I know you definitely have a different view, but I would like to see whether you...
No, I don't have a... I have a view that's complementary to that. It's different, but it's not contrary to that. I said in the United States, my own view is that this was a system failure with the thought experiment that there was no malfeasance. In fact, there was malfeasance, and we have sent people to jail. We will send more people to jail, and we will fine lots of people. So we will go after individuals who are responsible. The observation I wanted to make here was that even if those individuals had been better behaved than they were, I think we still would have had a failure. Now, part of the failure was the incentive structure. The incentive structure was throughout the American financial system, and I would say unhappily even beyond the financial system, is for short-term performance, short-term good performance. And one of the things we're grappling with, we have a new piece of legislation which is supposed to, in principle, make things a lot better in the future. We're in the process of fleshing out the details of that legislation, and one of the issues that we're grappling with, and when I say we, this was not just in America, but in Britain and in Europe, they're grappling with the same issues. Japan is different in this respect. The problems are different. As how can we blunt the financial incentives for good short-term performance, possibly at the expense of the long term? And it turned out, in this particular case, to be at the expense of the long term. So we're trying to figure out formulae for solving that particular problem. Here's one solution, just to give you an idea. It's not enough to speak at a general level. It's one thing to have general principles, but you have to translate general principles into operational guidelines. So here's one, that we will reward CEOs, the senior officers of financial institutions for good performance in the form of called stock options, which means they get stock which they can sell after a certain period of time. And then the question is, what should be that period of time? And so one possibility is that you get stock options for good performance last year, but you cannot exercise the stock options until 7 years from now. So you get the reward, but you cannot enjoy the reward until at least a version of the long term arrives, namely 7 years from now. And if in fact your good short-term performance has driven the company to the brink of bankruptcy, your stock options are going to be worth nothing 7 years from now. So it's that kind of thing that we're playing around with to provide incentives for good performance, but make sure that good performance is good long-term performance, not just good short-term performance.
Now we open up for general questions. You can make short comments or you ask questions. Don't make long comments.
Hello.
Please. We don't have a mic, so you may have to speak loudly, okay? Please.
Thank you. Thank you for your speech, Dr. Cooper. So I'm going to ask.
Oh,
about,
we have a mic, so why don't you use it?
I'd like to ask more about the exchange rate, as you last mentioned. You mentioned there are 3 channels that contribute to the inflation because of the exchange rate we are holding. But can you explain more about the benefits of it? Why Chinese government, as you think, wanted to hold that on?
I'm sorry, say the question again?
Why Chinese government back up that policy?
The Chinese government is afraid. This Chinese government is exceptionally cautious when it comes to economic policy. I watched with great interest and general approval the previous government of Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji. I know Zhu Rongji is not entirely popular with the Chinese, and particularly with Chinese officials. He was somewhat rough on them. But actually, I think Zhu Rongji, the things that he did were extremely beneficial for China. He made major reforms which were in the right direction, generally speaking. And so I'm a fan of the previous government. The current government is Wen Jiabao makes very nice speeches. He's a very good. He has a very nice touch. But in its actual behavior, what I observe is that it's much more cautious. I would be happy to go back to the exchange rate policy which China actually adopted in July 2005, which was a slow but steady appreciation of the currency. That policy was run for 3 years until July of 2008, and then, which was just on the eve of the crisis, and then it was stopped. And then the Chinese government last year talked as though it might revive that policy, and it introduced a little bit of flexibility, and we have seen some appreciation of the currency since last July, but it's been minuscule. It's been super cautious. Now I want to take the occasion to say one further thing, because I think it is an important background factor. A major source of Chinese growth, not by any means the only source, but a major source of Chinese growth has been export performance over the last 30 years. China has grown its exports on average at not only double-digit rates, but often over 20% a year. Those days are over. They are just over. China in 1980 was a small country, economically speaking, not of course in population or area, but in economic terms, China was a small country. Small countries can get away with things that big countries can't get away with. China is now the world's largest exporting country, having surpassed Germany, which was as the largest export. Well, it's close, but anyway, China's now the largest exporting country. China cannot grow its exports from now on at 20% a year or even at 10% a year. It's going to drop into single digits. That's necessary. And if it doesn't happen at the Chinese end, foreigners will do it for China through protection. That's a development I do not want to see, but I forecast it. If China tries to grow at export at 10, 15% a year, China will evoke a big reaction, a big negative reaction around the world. So as China thinks strategically about its directions for the future, it needs to give much less weight to exports and much more weight to domestic demand. That is accepted by the Chinese leadership. They all say that, but they don't do it. And that's what I say. Wen Jiabao makes good speeches, but he's much less good at translating his speeches into action. So what I'm suggesting is a concrete action to do something that, in my judgment, has to be done anyway, both under the inflation front and under the trade front. just to demonstrate what I mean, a common practice now around the world, including, by the way, in China, is to charge foreign goods with being dumped and to impose anti-dumping duties. So China has adopted that practice also, sadly. And the US does it, the Europeans do it. The country that does it the most, actually, is India. And guess, if you take the world as a whole, India is the country that uses anti-dumping actions the most. Guess who the biggest target is? China. China is the biggest target today. And there's nothing to stop that process. I think it's terrible, by the way. I mean, that's an altogether different. We need to reform the whole anti-dumping system at the global level. But that's a different subject. But as long as it exists, China is vulnerable. And if China doesn't take steps to restrain the growth of its exports, the rest of the world will. So another way of putting it is make a virtue out of necessity. It will help on the inflation front, and it's going to happen anyway.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful speech. And I'm from software and electronic school, so my question may be naive. And
oops, be on your guard.
And from my personal view, actually the financial crisis recently happened. Is the truth is the world paid a bill for American to build house. You see that the houses is in there, the infrastructures is in there, and American can buy house cheaper, but the people live in Beijing will spend more money to live in big house. So do you agree, and what's your opinion? Comments.
Simply say the housing market was the reason for the financial crisis.
Well,
he's already addressed that issue, right?
Yeah, the housing market was the source of the proximate cause, what precipitated the crisis. You need to understand how the American housing market works. First, it is a objective of policy, and has been for many, many years, that as many Americans as possible should own their own homes. That is seen as a positive development. That's a view that's not shared by all countries. For example, in Germany, most people rent their homes. The buildings are owned by somebody else. But Americans, for many, many decades, have attached social virtue to home ownership. So that's seen as a positive thing. Secondly, most Americans buy their homes by borrowing, using the homes as collateral. And the loans are very long-term, 15-year or 30-year. But 30-year loan is very common. So Americans are making long-term debt using their home as collateral, and they're against this social background. Now, the third factor, China is indirectly implicated. We had a big decline worldwide, not just in the United States, in long-term interest rates into the early part of the decade. To be very concrete, U.S. 30-year mortgage rates fell from over 8% in the year 2000 to below 6% in 2003. Now, those of you who know your financial math will know that a drop in interest rates from 8 to 6% on a 30-year loan makes a very big difference to the monthly payment you make on the loan. Drops almost by 25%. These mortgages are amortized, so you pay interest and principal together over a 30-year period. So the worldwide drop in interest rates, in which China's surplus is contributed. China was not the only factor, but China's trade surplus contributed to this worldwide drop in long-term interest rates. Actually facilitated the housing boom in the United States. So many Americans could afford to buy houses at these new lower interest rates than before. That's the background against which demand for housing rose and prices of existing houses rose. And so we had the very heavy construction. We built too many houses. And we also had a rise in house prices. And then, and here's a similarity with China, many Americans came to think that house prices could never go down. House prices would go up forever, or at worst flatten out for a little bit and then go up. And therefore, the mortgage, the value of the mortgage, your debt, relative to the value of the house, would decline steadily over time, and it was easier to deal with the mortgage. Well, that turned out to be a false assumption. House prices actually reached their peak in 2006, a year after the construction reached its peak. And so a lot of people who borrowed against their houses found themselves in an unanticipated situation in which the value of their houses was going down instead of up, as they expected. Now, I know there's a lot of interest in China about whether there's a bubble in Chinese housing now, and I do not have an opinion on that question. My view is that the fundamentals for Chinese housing are very strong. What do I mean by the fundamentals? I mean, China is urbanizing rapidly. Lots of people are moving from the countryside into cities. That creates demand for housing. Secondly, incomes are rising very rapidly in China. And we know, both from observing China over the last 30 years, but it's a worldwide experience, one of the things that people want more of as they get richer is housing. They want more space and they want better quality. And as Chinese incomes go up, you see, and some of you and certainly your parents are probably exactly in this situation of having upgraded their housing, maybe even 2 or 3 times over the last 30 years. And so the fundamentals are very strong. That fact makes it very difficult to determine whether there's a bubble in the housing market. You need to look at much finer structure to make a judgment, and I have not been able to look at the fine structure, so I don't have a view. There could be a bubble, but as I say, the fundamentals are strong, so there may be no bubble. And it's a big country. There may be bubbles in some part of the country and not bubbles in other parts of the country.
Next question. Yes, please. I'll excuse myself for 1 minute. You take care of it.
Yeah.
Professor, thanks for your speech. Professor, thanks for your speech. And my major is financial information engineering. Recently, I do some research on the capital markets. And so my question is, I found that there are some relationship between the development of the world capital markets and between the capital markets and the world economy. And I want to ask you about what's your opinion about those 2 things, the relationship and the other things between them. That's
Well, first, I think your opening observation is correct. And what we've seen during the last 30 years is a globalization of the capital markets. We still have a long way to go. We're actually not, we don't have a fully globalized financial market yet, but the situation today is very, very different from what it was 30 years ago. And it's that development that made it possible for me to say what I just said in response to the earlier question, which is surplus savings in China and other countries, in Japan, and there are other surplus countries, permitted a lowering of long-term interest rates worldwide. Doesn't matter these days where the savings is. It gets into the financial markets one way or another and influences demand for savings everywhere. So I think that is unquestionably a fact of the current life. China and India, to take 2 big emerging markets, are still somewhat insulated from the world capital market because formally you have controls on both inflows of capital and outflows of capital. It does not mean that those flows don't take place, but they legally speaking, they require permission. So you, as Chinese, cannot invest freely in the New York stock market or the London stock market or the Toronto stock market. I, as a non-Chinese, cannot invest freely in Chinese financial assets. Both ways, both inflows and outflows are controlled. And the same is true in India, by the way. The details differ, but the same is true in India. So here are two big countries that are not fully integrated yet into the world capital market. Now, is this globalization of the financial market a good thing or a bad thing? Very complicated question, I think. I think most economists would say unambiguously this is a good development. I am not among them. I have very ambivalent views toward full freedom of capital movements. There are some obvious positive benefits, but there are also some risks associated with this globalization of financial markets. And we experienced in 2008 some of the risks came home to roost. So one of the things that all governments, both separately and together, in Basel, Switzerland, which is where they meet with these international committees, are looking at are what are called macroprudential policies. That is to say, to what extent should each national government in its regulatory framework put some barriers between what the local financial institutions can do and what they can't do. So that's an issue of hot discussion and disagreement these days. But just give you one example of what I think was actually a positive innovation, but turned out to have some negative consequences. Starting about 20 years ago, I've already described the mortgage situation in the United States. It used to be that mortgage loans to potential home purchasers like me were made by the local bank. We have 7,000 banks in the United States. We used to have about twice that many. But we have lots and lots of banks. And the American homeowner or would-be homeowner would go to the local bank to get a local loan, 15 or 30-year loan. The bank would look at the property and decide yes or no and make the loan and keep it on its books for 15 or 30 years. Extremely illiquid, long-term loan. About 20 years ago, we began to standardize the mortgage loans and securitize them so that these mortgage loans got packaged into securities. They're called mortgage-backed securities, MBSs, and then they could be purchased not just by the local bank, but by insurance companies or by pension funds or other long-term investors. And I actually think that was a positive innovation. It meant much more capital could come into the housing market, and it meant that the mortgages became much more liquid as assets because there was a secondary market in trading. So that was a positive development. But then it turned out that some of these mortgage-backed securities had some poor quality mortgages in them. They began to be purchased internationally, so that the financial crisis, actually the US origin financial crisis, first showed up in Europe in institutions that had purchased some of these mortgage-backed securities and then found they couldn't value them. And so they had to stop trading in them. So this is a US development, which by itself I think was positive, with international implications, which turned out at the end of the day to be negative. So it's a very complex domain, and I think one cannot get away with big generalizations. One has to get into the level of operational detail to make judgments about which things are good to do and which things are not good to do.
There's a question now? Yes, please.
First, thanks, Professor. I have two questions.
Use the mic.
It doesn't work.
Of course it works.
Hello? Okay. Thanks, Professor. I have two questions. First, about Euro. You mentioned that, but we find that there are some problems when in crisis when all the European countries share one currency policy, and for some countries they can't print their own money anymore, and we find this it's a problem. But do you still support that the Euro system, I mean the one currency policy for all the countries, or do you think it's a trend? And the second question is about China, and I happen to find that you know China longer than I do. So I wonder, what in your mind, what's the most important, the biggest long-term economics problem for China? Thanks.
On the euro, I should have said, I think the euro is not in jeopardy as a result of the Greek crisis. I know some people, including some Europeans, say that, but I think the European commitment to the euro is a very deep one, strong political commitment, and so I think the euro itself is not in jeopardy. But managing one currency for several countries does create some challenges, and the Europeans, and when I say the Europeans, I'm including now financial markets, not just the European governments, I think have not really absorbed all of these challenges. I was frankly astonished that the Greeks could continue to borrow as long as they did at such a low price. We have in the United States 50 different states. They are sovereign states under our Constitution. They are sovereign states. The federal government has no financial commitment to those states. In fact, we have many transfers, but they're all programmatic transfers. There is no general commitment of the federal government to the individual states. So they're on their own. And they float bonds, they borrow, and they float bonds, and you see quite a differentiation in the market of what the different states pay, depending on the fiscal situation of each state. The one that's of interest to all of us now at the moment is California. Happens to be a very big state with serious fiscal problems. But nobody talks about a federal government bailout of California. California's on its own, but it has a single currency. It has and the market is pricing California debt appropriately. So I think there was a market failure in Europe, among other things, and we've gone from underpricing of risk earlier in the decade, in my judgment, to overpricing of risk now. I mean, the financial markets have just gone from one extreme to the other, and we're now overpricing risk. But I think that financial markets will not make the same mistake in the future that they did in the last decade, and that countries with weak fiscal situations, such as Greece, will pay a price for it when it actually floats its debt. And so I think that's actually part of the solution. I mean, we have to get through the immediate problem, but in terms of the long term, I think that's actually part of the solution. We'll get sensible market signals about when a country does not have adequate fiscal discipline, and there will be more differentiation among the countries. I am not sympathetic to what is the current fashion in Europe, which is to have a consolidated fiscal agency centered in Brussels, in which the member states have to review their fiscal authorities with Brussels before they can go forward with them. That goes absolutely to the heart of democratic politics. I cannot imagine anything more anathema to to democratic philosophy than taking the budget out of the control of local parliaments. I think it would be a huge mistake to do that for Europe as a whole. What I think would be wise, and I suggested it already 10 years ago, again with American experience as a background, I think it would be wise, it would have been wise when the euro was created to take all of the outstanding national debt in the Eurozone and consolidate it into a European debt. This does not mean that the country that people were worried about in 1999 or in the 90s was Italy, because Italy had very high debt relative to Greece. Greece was not in the picture at that time, but Italy was the country people were worried about. So the Italians would still be responsible for servicing the Italian debt, but it would be in the form of euro bonds rather than Italian bonds denominated in euros. Alexander Hamilton, the first American Secretary of Treasury, wisely, in my view, consolidated the debts of the original 13 states into a federal debt. It was a very shrewd move. And I think the Europeans should have done the same. The European financial market would be much further developed now, 15 years later, than it is. The Europeans now have revived that idea, or really looked at it seriously for the first time. And at the moment, anyway, they are still rejecting it. And I think that's a mistake. I've been an outside watcher of Europe for about half a century. It's been a fascinating excursion, how Europeans are putting Europe together bit by bit by bit by bit.
Please.
Oh, there was a second question. I'm sorry.
About China.
Oh, long-run problems for China. Oh, well, that's potentially a very long list. It's possible to imagine many things going wrong. I am impressed by the pragmatic nature of Chinese leadership. I attribute it, perhaps wrongly, but I attribute it to their training as engineers. Engineers are problem solvers, and the Chinese leaders move from one problem to another, and they focus on the problem and they solve it. So my outlook for China for the next decade or two is basically a positive one. I mean, not that problems won't arise, but I think the leadership will identify them and address them in a pragmatic and not in an ideological way. But if one were to make a list of things that could go wrong, it's actually quite a long list. I will just mention a sensitive topic. I've learned over the years that the subject of Taiwan is an extremely emotional one in China. Many Chinese cannot actually think rationally about Taiwan. I take that as a given, and so if the Taiwanese do something that's highly provocative, the Chinese government is capable, with public support, of doing something that's really stupid, in my view. So I think, and part of the problem is Taiwan is a taboo subject, so you cannot discuss it among yourselves. So you cannot discuss the pros and cons of this, and it's a very complicated issue. But I identify that as an area where something could go badly wrong for emotional reasons, provoked by something in Taiwan, but then with a Chinese reaction to what happens on Taiwan. The financial system is still heavily repressed in China. And one can imagine a number of things going wrong with the financial system. I mean, what's amazing I'm going to put this very bluntly now, Chinese public has very strong confidence in its banks. Most Chinese savings go into bank accounts which pay very low interest rates, and that the banks grossly misuse the deposits of Chinese households and produce non-performing loans and all kinds of things. One can imagine the Chinese public discovering that the banking system is pretty bad and taking their money out of the banks. You could have serious bank runs. My interpretation of what's going on is that the Chinese public figures that at the end of the day, the government will bail out the banks. And that's probably a reasonable assumption. It's probably a correct assumption. But one can imagine the Chinese public losing confidence in the banks, something we experienced in Ireland just 2 years ago and in Iceland. and that would create a very, very serious problem. And, well, as I say, the potential list is a long one.
Thank you. Professor, I think over 40 years ago, you raised the concept of interdependence. And after this, over 40 years, do you want to add something to this concept after all, especially in the background of the big crisis? That's my first question. And another one is, you say, as a dynamics, this crisis actually pushed the multilateral mechanism a lot, especially over the IMF reform and the G20. Do you think that could help for in the long run? After all, every state, the individual states still do a lot of things like the protectionism and back the neighbor policy. So what's your comment on that?
On the first point, I guess the only thing is, the allusion is to a book I wrote a long time ago, which had got some attention at the time. It was called The Economics of Interdependence. I'm sorry now I did not title it The Economics of Globalization. Interdependence has dropped out of the vocabulary and globalization has come into the vocabulary. I think the things that I wrote in that book, of course the details have all evolved a lot over 4 decades, but the basic things I wrote in the book are still problems today. And the central problem of the book was how to reconcile national autonomy with international interdependence. And we have that problem at least as much today as we did then. I was just early in seeing and identifying this as a problem for the world as a whole. And we still have that problem, and in a way, the Greek issue dramatizes it, especially for Europeans. You know, do we leave the decisions about Greece mainly to the Greeks? Do we take it entirely out of the hands of the Greeks and move it to Brussels? Or do we have some compromise? And of course the answer is we're going to have some compromise, but there are many, many, many different possible compromises, and where does it end up? On the response of the official international monetary system to the crisis, I'm not sure I completely understood your question, but I will make a remark. I actually think that the international monetary system dealt with the crisis rather well. It did not, of course, prevent the crisis. One of the markets that did not freeze up at all, which I thought was really interesting, was the foreign exchange market. The foreign exchange market continued to function throughout this period. Trade credits dried up, all kinds of things happened, but the foreign exchange market continued to function. For students of the details of this, that's worth thinking about. Why did that particular market continue to function? It's made by many of the same players. The big banks of the world basically make the foreign exchange market. The interbank lending market dried up. The foreign exchange market continued to function. It's really interesting to ask why that happened. Secondly, I think the central banks, the leading central banks, performed very well. Above all, the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, but also the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and others. The Federal Reserve Bank acted boldly, in very large magnitude, and in very unorthodox ways. And I think all of that was entirely appropriate in the circumstances. I know there's going to be a lot of criticism, but I'm not among the critics. I think we were all lucky, we Americans, but also I would even say the rest of the world, that Ben Bernanke was chairman at this time. As a scholar at Princeton University, Ben Bernanke had studied the Great Depression of the 1930s. And he understood much better than most economists did how, if the financial system goes wrong, how much damage it can do to the real economy. So he had an appreciation from his study of that period of history for what the worst could look like. and so he led the charge to do what central banks could do, and there will be a lot of complaints. Just a simple measure, it doesn't capture everything, but a simple measure, the liabilities of the Fed rose from $900 billion to almost $2.3 trillion in 6 months, from between July and December 2008. Huge increase in what economists called M0, I mean base money. Huge increase. Drove monetarists like Alan Meltzer up the wall. He said, we're building in inflation from now to infinity. Just shows how little Alan Meltzer understood about what was going on. But I'm not a monetarist. Anyway, so I think the central banks, now a question that's worth asking, and I have asked, is why the International Monetary Fund didn't play such a role. And there are institutional answers to that question. And as I think about reforming the international system going forward, I would actually give the Monetary Fund much more scope, more authority for dealing with financial crises of this type. But not everyone shares that view. But anyway, I write papers making proposals, so I've made a number of proposals along these lines. Having said that, I think the Monetary Fund under Strauss-Kahn actually did very well, given its limitations. But Strauss-Kahn, who is now in the doghouse, but as leader of the IMF, he brought a political forcefulness to that institution at the right time. And so the IMF, although it could not have done what the Federal Reserve and the ECB did, it came in behind and again acted in unorthodox ways within its charter in ways that were helpful. IMF lending went way up in 2009, which was very helpful in combating the recession.
Thank you. Maybe say a word about Zhu Ming or Min Zhu, who's now at
You want me to say a word about Min Zhu? Well,
yeah, unrelated.
Well, it's lately in the news that Chinese has been appointed, unhappily the news says, the deputy managing director. The correct English is a deputy managing director because there are 4 of them, and he's just one. He's, but he's the first Chinese to be made deputy managing director. He happens to be a friend of mine. He's an extraordinarily able person, and I think it's good for the IMF. It's good for China. It's good all around that he's been put in this position.
Another question? Yes, please. Okay. Why don't you go ahead? You go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, Professor Cooper. Very nice to meet you. And I have 2 questions. The first one is, since there are many economic entities that are experiencing expansion of industrialization, such as China and India and some countries in Africa. Someone predicts that the oil price will keep going up in the recent years. You mentioned in your lecture that the fluctuation of oil price is one of the 3 factors that accounts for the recent economic crisis. But someone argues that there are bubbles exist. So my question is, what's your comment on the argument? And the second one is, I'm very interested in economic history, especially for the financial crisis. So the second question is, let me think.
Take your time. We have an hour to wait. But let him ask.
I'll answer the first question while you're thinking about the second one. First, just to correct, what I said in my talk was that the sharp rise in oil prices this year was one of the factors that was inhibiting the recovery. Not a source of the crisis, but it was inhibiting the recovery. Now, on the long-term oil price, they could go up. They could go up. It all depends on two things, and that depends on the time dimension. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit. It depends on investment decisions by Saudi Arabia. We are all in the hands of Saudi Arabia. I use Saudi Arabia as a, put it in quotes, I use it as a metaphor for the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. So it includes the UAE, it includes Kuwait, it includes Iraq. But these are the countries that have lots and lots of oil reserves. The oil in all of these countries is state-owned, and so the rest of us, the rest of the world, is dependent on the investment decisions that they make in the, I would say, the medium run. In the long run, we're dependent on technical change, and those two things tend to push in opposite directions. Let me say what I mean. I cannot do the numbers from memory, but the demand for oil, the world demand for oil has grown, I'll make up the number, let's say by 100% in the last 30 years. It's now just short of 90 million barrels a day, and I don't remember what it was in 1980, but let's say it was half that. So there's been a big demand in the growth for oil. There's also been a big increase in the price of oil over that period of time. And the interesting fact is that almost all of that increased demand for oil has been supplied by non-OPEC countries, including Russia. Russia's the biggest. And of course, Russia has had a change of politics between 1980 and now. So oil supply is sensitive to price. And we've just seen, well, now about 2 years ago, big new discoveries of oil off Brazil in deep, deep water. Water that was inaccessible 30 years ago. So the technical change is marching on and producing resources which either we didn't know we had, or we knew we had them, but they were totally inaccessible in an economic way. So we have this technical change going on and in the long term, but we had demand rising in the from year to year. And the two may not match exactly. So the decisions of Saudi Arabia on investment in oil are actually very important for the world. Now the Saudis understand that because they know if they do not supply the oil that's demanded at a reasonable price, and then there's lots of room for debate over what is a reasonable price. But if they don't supply it at a reasonable price, technical change will undermine the value of their reserves in the long run. The Saudis understand that. The technocrats in Saudi Arabia understand that. So there's this balance of considerations. The Saudi Arabian decisions are basically non-market decisions. They have their own revenue needs. They have their concerns about technical change in the long run. They're very concerned about the movement of the world automobile fleets to electric cars, for example. If you can imagine, it would take 30 years, but if you can imagine 30 years from now, automobiles running on electricity rather than on gasoline, that's a really, really big deal for the oil market. So the Saudis have a complicated investment decision that they have to make, and we're all dependent on their investment decisions.
We only have time for one last question. Not you, forget about your question now. No.
Okay. Professor Cooper, my question is that you have mentioned that China is becoming one of the largest export country, and there are a lot of products in the international market that are made in China, but few of Chinese brands. So what the factors that you think that make Chinese brand can get into the international market successfully, and what factors, what elements can make Chinese brand get into the international market successfully? That's all.
Thank you.
First, again, I have a personal confession to make. I am much less interested in branded products than most people are, either Americans or Chinese. Why anyone would be willing to pay 4 times the price because something had Gucci written on it, even though it performed the same function of carrying around your stuff, I do not know. It's something I just don't understand about people. But I know that Chinese are very brand conscious. I know that Americans are brand conscious, and so I'm an outlier. Makes it difficult for me to talk about brands. Second thing, I spent my young years, teenage years, as a farmer. There's no branding in agriculture. We produced wheat. We produced good quality wheat, good #2 winter wheat, Kansas winter wheat, and we sold it into the wheat market. We produced lambs. We sold it into the lamb market. We produced wool. We sold it into the wool market. Now, there's an issue of quality, and you have to pay attention. The buyer looks carefully at the quality of the wool, looks carefully at the quality of the wheat, so you have to pay attention to quality, but no brands on that, see. So my first question is, why are you interested in brands? My second observation, which is an empirical one, because I had a really interesting conversation with a Japanese minister now many years ago, and he explained to me, because he was personally involved, how Japan moved from a global reputation for cheap, low-quality manufacturers, which is where Japan was in the 20s and 30s and the early 50s, to having a reputation for high-quality, first-rate products. And his particular field of interest was cameras. And the Japanese already in the early 50s were producing cameras quite cheaply and selling them cheaply into the world market. But some of them were not very good. And so he got the I know I'm reporting accurately what I heard. I cannot verify the facts, but I'm reporting accurately what I was told. He got the other manufacturers together. It was not the Japanese government, which is important, because the mythology is the Japanese government was at the center of everything. You look closely at what happened in Japan, it's simply not true. Anyway, in this particular story, it was a private initiative. It said, we camera producers, if we want to make it in the world market, by the way, the Germans had the reputation for producing the best ordinary cameras, and the Americans had the reputation for producing the best sort of movie cameras and specialized cameras, but German cameras for households, Leica and other German firms. He said, we Japanese have to control the quality of our exports. We should not export any defective product. And so a group of Japanese firms got together, created an association to inspect every camera that was exported from Japan. And over the course of about 5 years, Japan moved from being low quality, cheap but low quality products to being not so cheap but very high quality products. Starting with cameras, moving to binoculars, and then Sony came along. That's a special story of innovation. But the lesson in the story about cameras is you change your reputation by earning it, and you earn it by producing only and selling into the world market only first-class products. The branding actually came later. So buyers like me came to associate Nikon with first-rate cameras, or Canon with first-rate cameras. The actual branding came later. First was quality control. Quality control.
Thank you very much. And I must say that Professor Cooper and Ms. Chen Jing are here in China as professors at People's University. Renmin Dashi. And so they're involved in the summer school. We're very lucky that we managed to invite them here to give this brilliant presentation. And I thank you all for coming. We're a little bit afraid because it was only publicized about a day or so. I'm afraid that only 2 of us will be here for a dialogue. But so many of you showed up. Thank you very much, and thank you. Thanks. That's terrific. I even understand everything.
Well, yes, I'm not heavy into economic jargon.
I'm a student majoring in both physics and finance, so I'm quite interested in financial.
You can sit down.
Sit down. Innovation, financial innovation. But since you're talking about the financial crisis from America, I'm just very interested about after the crisis, what exactly did the government do to improve the monetary